Hi, I'm Una Mannion, and I'm delighted to have been invited to host this conversation on nonfiction with Sara Baume and Ian Maleney for Cairde Connected. Cairde Connected runs until Saturday, the 11th of July, and you can check out events on cairdefestival.com. All events are free, but if you care to, you can donate using the button below on your screen. Today, we are lucky to have Irish authors Ian Maleney and Sara Baume, who'll be reading from and talking about their works of nonfiction, Minor Monuments and Handiwork. And I'd like to welcome them both to Sligo virtually and to introduce them. And I'll start with Ian. Ian Maleney is a writer based in Dublin. Born and raised in rural County Offaly, he works as a freelance arts journalist, primarily for the Irish Times, but also for many other publications. He's the online editor at The Stinging Fly. His essays have been published by Winter Papers, Gorse, and the Dublin Review. He's the founder of Fallow Media, a reader-supported online interdisciplinary journal for music, photography, and literature. Minor Monuments was published, was published in April 2019 by Tramp Press. It is a collection of essays about family, memory, belonging, dementia, silence, and the power of sound. It is set around his family's farm on the edge of a County Offaly bog. With us also is Sara Baume. Sara Baume is a writer and visual artist based in West Cork. Her writing has won the Davy Byrnes Short Story Award, the Hennessy New Irish Writing Award, the Rooney Prize, and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. She has previously written 2 fiction novels, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, and A Lie Made by Walking. We will be discussing her third book, Handiwork, her nonfiction debut, published earlier this year, also by Tramp Press. Handiwork is a contemplative, sometimes fragmentary narrative, charting the author's daily process over a year of writing and making hundreds of small objects. Photographs of carved birds that she made demarcate sections of the book and link handicraft to the themes of the book: bird migration, daily ritual, objects, and what it is to live as an artist. Both Sara and Ian have creative practices other than writing that impact the composition and texture of their works. In some respects, these practices are part of the book's subjects. Sara is a visual artist, and Ian is a sound engineer or sound artist. And we'll be looking at the overlaps of these artistic disciplines, the significance of place, and the work of art as a monument, an object that staves off disappearance and forgetting. And we're going to start today with readings from both authors. And Ian, I'd like to invite you to read first and perhaps tell us what you're reading and why you chose this excerpt.
Sure. Thanks for having us, Una. So I'm just going to read a small bit from the start of the book, because I guess the first essay in the book is it probably contains in miniature like all the main sort of themes in the book as a whole. So it's kind of about visiting the bog where I grew up, like going home, bringing my partner there and sort of observing what was happening to my grandparents, particularly my grandfather at the time. So I'll just crack on. The first time Niamh came with me to my parents' farm, I took her to the bog. It's not much of a destination, but it's about the only place you can go if you want to get out of the house. We followed the road down by my grandparents' place, which is next door to ours, and around the back of the cattle sheds. At the end of our fields is a shaded lane that takes you through to where the bog begins. The lane forks at the end and becomes 2 grass-covered paths that go deeper into the bog. We hung a right towards the elevated heather-covered bank where my grandparents used to save their turf. Getting to the high bank means wading through some tall, stiff grass growing from very wet ground. Even in summer, it can be a messy business. Neither of us were adequately dressed, but we got as far as the bottom of the bank and stood for a while next to a sheer 6-foot face of deep brown peat. Niamh took a photo of me there with her phone. I had my hands in the pockets of my hoodie, and I looked back over my shoulder towards her, wind blown, my face balled up in a squint. Upon uploading it to Facebook, she added the caption, Out here in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. The bog is a quiet place. No matter how often I go there, no matter how closely I listen, it remains a quiet place. There are 3 primary sounds: the wind in the scattered trees, the birds, and the remote sounds which are not of the bog but which are audible there all the same. Chainsaws, lawnmowers, tractors, engines beyond the horizon. These elements combine in different measures on different days. A windless day leaves the far-off hums exposed and sharpens the hollow bark of a dog on a distant farm. The birds come alive in the early evening, and their pinprick calls are soft and charming. On a stormy day, there is nothing but wind, a dull blast obliterating all else as it makes its way across the plain. I have stood in all kinds of weather out on the high bank with my recorder aloft. Standing up there once, I could hear a very faint drone, a sound I thought might be a train or even motorway traffic on the far side of the Shannon, something miles and miles away. Rooted like a tree as the minutes crawled past, I closed my eyes and tried in vain to make sense of this vague shadow of a sound. Then I looked up. A gigantic swarm of midges were forming a dark humming cloud a foot above my head. My legs took action before I had time to think, and I ran wildly towards home, plunging through the chest-high grass. Breathless at the edge of the bog, my vision of myself as an intrepid field recordist in tatters, I began to laugh at my instinct for flight. Niamh and I returned to the bog, some years after our first visit, to record sounds for a project she was working on. She wanted to capture the squelching and burbling of the sodden ground. I jumped in and out of liquid earth, lost a Wellington, made all sorts of noises. On our way home, we walked through my grandparents' backyard, where my grandmother was filling buckets of turf. We stopped to chat with Nana for a while, and my grandfather came out to join us. Jojo wasn't particularly mobile at this stage, and I remember how long it took him to cross the narrow strip of concrete to where we were standing. He was nearly bent double over his walking stick. "He won't even know who you are until he comes over near you now, honestly," Nana said as he shuffled towards us. She warned Niamh that he would repeatedly ask her the same questions. "Do you know this fella Jojo?" she said. "Ah, I'd know now if I could get time to look at him," came the reply. "Oh Lord, I know you well, but I just can't put a name on you." Nana explained to him that I was his grandson, that I was from just up the garden. You could tell he was better at bluffing than he was at remembering. When he found out Niamh lived in Dublin, he sang a little bit of Molly Malone for her. Always a charmer, he took her hand and said she was a lovely girl, a lovely, lovely girl. "Don't squeeze the hand off her now. You are very fond of them," Nana said. "I'm not," he protested. "That's what has me in trouble now with you." Nana pushed him again to remember who I was. "We reared him," she said. "Well," he replied, "we dragged him up." We talked a little about my brothers, about the cattle my father had recently bought, and the way the weeks were passing quicker than ever. Nana couldn't get over how it was October already, the year nearly gone. Jojo piped up. It's like the woman said one time when she pegged the clock out through the window. "Time flies." The Alzheimer's is a curse, as Nana would say, but it's easier if you've got a sense of humour. When we left, they walked together towards the back door of the house, bickering playfully about tea time, slices of currant bread. I can only remember all this because Niamh had accidentally left the recorder running. It had been working the entire time, recording the conversation from a pocket of her backpack. She cut this section out for me, and I have it still. It's only 3 years ago, but it feels like so much longer. As the clip ends, their voices are fading away, becoming quieter and quieter still. That'll do.
Thank you. And maybe I'll turn it over to Sara now if you'd like to introduce the excerpt that you're going to read.
Yeah, that was gorgeous, Cian. I was reading along and you kept skipping around all over. Found out.
On online editing.
I think I do that as well. I change words that I find I can't actually pronounce in real life. Um, but I'm going to start at the start because it's probably the easiest thing. The book is very fragmentary, so to try and explain it, I think I try and explain it really in the opening couple of pages. So that's what I'll read. I suppose bear in mind that I started writing it in 2018, and I wrote it very quickly in the course of about 6 months, and it was really for me a means of just finding connections in things, and finding enough connections in things to be able to put them together. And it was more than anything else a means of justifying the huge amount of time I found myself spending on visual projects, on making things. And this seems sort of ridiculous to me in my mid-30s, that I was really just following through on projects I'd started when I was 3 or 4 years old, in a way. So the book was a means of perhaps intellectualizing that, but certainly justifying it. So it starts with a quote by an academic called Stephen Knott, who's written a book about the history and theory of amateur craft, and that's something I'm very interested in. And model railways and such things come into the book. So it starts with a brief quote, and then there's a few pages afterwards that set it in context. Amateurs, Stephen Knott writes in Amateur Craft, History and Theory, have their own convoluted, inefficient and superfluous processes of production that reflect their subjectivity and freedom from the obligation to produce a defined output. There is an Alaskan songbird, the Northern Meteor. She weighs about as much as a small ball of wool, and every autumn she flies about as far as 300,000 balls of wool, unspooled in a westerly direction, disentangled across Siberia and Kazakhstan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia, finally coming to a definitive stop in East Africa. It takes her 3 months to get there and 2.5 months to get back again. And so the Northern Meteor devotes almost half of every year to these journeys, which she makes out of countless individual flaps, beating her wings continuously against winds prevailing and preternatural over the course of 30,000 kilometers of sky. There are easier routes she could take. There are places with clement climates far closer to Alaska than sub-Saharan Africa. But the Northern Meteor doesn't choose them. She doesn't choose at all. Every autumn, she follows the route her ancestors initiated at the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago. The convoluted, inefficient, superfluous directions that are her genetic inheritance. And then, in spring, she goes the same way back again. I hear the story of the Northern Meteor on a day in spring from a podcast which I listen to, sitting in the straight-back chair at the eastern end of the living room table. I sit there every day between the hours of 12 and 4, parallel to the windowsill, and overshadowed by a row of books, a Christmas cactus, a dusty globe which encapsulates a long-expired light bulb. When I retell a version of the story of the journey of the Northern Meteor to Mark later in the evening, a slightly erroneous, airily embellished version, he remarks that there are fish who swim against the current, salmon and herring who live in the open sea, but are compelled to travel back to the rivers and streams in which they were born in order to spawn. And this gives me cause to remember a tiny goldfish I owned for a year or so in my early 20s who, on the occasion of having her water changed, would make every effort to resist being poured from a corner of her narrow tank into a giant mayonnaise jar. The goldfish would go to the place where the last of her water pooled as the glass was lifted. She would turn her face to point in the opposite direction of the tilt. She would push against the force of gravity and the flow of water, wriggling her entire body as if burrowing upwards through thick soil. And it sort of goes to another chapter and starts with another quote. The workshop is the craftsman's home, Richard Sennett writes in The Craftsman. Traditionally, this was literally so. In the Middle Ages, craftsmen slept, ate, and raised their children in the places where they worked. This house is a house of industry. It has 4 bedrooms, only one of which is devoted to sleep. The straight-back chair at the eastern end of the living room table, parallel to the windowsill and its clutter, is one of several workstations dispersed between rooms. starting outside the back door with the rusted yard tap and extending all the way through to the weather-worn garden bench. The short stretch of countertop alongside the kitchen sink is a mixing station. There's a sack of modelling plaster and a stack of plastic containers rescued from the recycling bin, the tall round pots of yogurt and the flimsy trays of rectangular biscuits, big rolls, malted milks, custard creams. There's a porcelain scoop for measuring the correct ratio of plaster to water, and a tall stemmed teaspoon for whisking the powdery lumps away. Wet plaster must be creamy. Once poured, I bump the base of the mould gently against the surface of the countertop in order to hustle any residual air to the surface, to set it free. Tiny bubbles obligingly rise and burst, a stipple pattern of negative space appears. And then I kind of run through all of the stations of the house and the rather boring things that I do there, and that accumulates in the television station. So I'll just read that and then I'll leave it. This is the station where each evening comes to an end. I spend its final 3 hours cross-legged on the sofa. The same cushion I use as a tray to eat my dinner off becomes a platform upon which to apply paint to a succession of small objects after dinner has been eaten. The television flickers and I listen to it. In most cases, the story can be followed from sound alone, but I glance up every now and again in order to identify speakers, in order to maintain some kind of visual momentum through each program. At dinner time, a drinking vessel is added to the other glasses on the low coffee table, and so it often happens as the evening wears on that I plop a sullied brush into the clear water or take a thoughtless sip of the paint-tainted stuff.
Thank you.
Probably enough.
Thank you so much, both of you. And Ian, I might start with you, and just from that initial essay in Minor Monuments, and in that essay you talk about the work of two other artists, Richard Skelton's Landings, excuse me.
Landings, yeah.
And a Pat Collins film, Silence. And it struck me about you're looking at two other artists and yourself, and this each kind of attuning, each of you listening to a landscape and the narratives of place that got released in the act of listening. So I was wondering if you could just tell me something about the recording that you have started to do, and the impact of that creative practice on the writing and the book that you've created.
Sure. I mean, there wouldn't be a book without the recording. I think that's become clear to me. So I started recording things, I guess, when I was a teenager, maybe 13, 14 years old. I played guitar and that kind of thing, badly, but alone in the room. And we got a microphone. My brother played the drums and learned how to connect said microphone to a computer and kind of took it from there. Just got really interested in capturing sound and how different it is to actually listening, and how they are connected but kind of two separate things, and separate again from actually making sound. And then so I went to college, studied sound engineering, because I thought I wanted to be a studio engineer. Turned out I absolutely did not want to do that, because you have to spend all day with musicians. But so through college, I kind of was exposed, I guess, to a lot of different sound creating and sound recording practices that I wouldn't have been aware of before, while at the same time getting kind of frustrated with studio recording and feeling kind of hemmed in by the sort of ways that things are done. And also kind of locked out of it for budgetary reasons, as well. But so we had a little sort of, we converted the shed at home into a kind of mini recording studio when we were teenagers, and that's where most of my sort of learning about sound happened. And it was just being in there by myself for like long periods of time, or with my brother or with other people, pointing microphones at things, figuring out how to do things our own way. That gradually kind of led me out of the studio itself, like just being kind of more tuned into the accidents that happen and the sort of, experiments that you might do, and how that kind of over time led me to just recording ambient sounds and recording weird resonances that you might find in a building, or all kinds of field recordings, and doing recordings of other people in strange places, like under a bridge or something, just for the acoustic of the whole thing. So that came for me like long before writing really did, or at least any more serious writing than terribly embarrassing teenage lyrics for songs that no one will ever hear. So as time went by, the two, like you asked about Pat Collins, and I think seeing Silence for me was just a really formative moment, in that I had been thinking, I guess, and observing my grandparents, and I'd always kind of written about them, and because I grew up right next to them and I was quite close to them, and to see a film like Silence, where it just felt like it was made entirely for my benefit, like it was exactly the kind of thing, both in form and content, that I was interested in at that time, realized on a just at a level I couldn't have imagined it being done before. So I think it was seeing that made me realize what was possible, in that you could meld these different forms of, I guess, semi-documentary, which for writing, I guess, is a kind of essay nonfiction form, and the semi-fictional thing, and have it all, and then mixing the visual side but at the same time putting the audio front and center in a way that I had never really seen before. It was just very inspiring, and it made me take the act of recording a lot more seriously than I had been, even though I'd been to college and all that and studied it. But it became personal in a way that it hadn't been before. And then I started recording my grandparents. I started recording the atmosphere around our house where I grew up, and it kind of grew from there.
Yeah. Thank you. I actually found the description of the Skelton and the Pat Collins films and the Skelton exhibition incredibly poetic. And this, you describe Pat Collins, the character Owen, listening almost to a tape that comes on the wind that's bringing him back to Tory Island and to home. And it's just so beautiful. I might move to Sara, and you begin the book with this description of the Northern Meteor and its convoluted, inefficient, and superfluous, flight path. And the bird's arduous journey seems to be similar to that of the artist in some way, and maybe is a sustained metaphor for the book. And I was wondering if you could talk about why the book begins with that bird and her path, and maybe just a little bit about birds and their paths throughout the book.
Yeah, well, it was when I struck upon that bird and its story that, really, you're right, it was the sustained metaphor that I struck upon, and I thought, yeah, there's I suppose when you're writing notes about what you're doing, which, it started essentially as kind of, like I say, trying to justify why I've always had this insistence to work with my hands, where it came from, and why I continue to pursue it, even in the face of, what might be an otherwise brilliant career. I keep making these things. So it began as an exploration of that, but I kind of felt, and like this is exhibited in all of Ian's essays in a way. In order to write about one thing, sometimes you have to write about something seemingly unconnected, or various different elements have to coincide. Like even looking again at the structure of that first essay, Ian, I could see that, you were jumping around from thing to thing. So I suppose I was thinking in those terms, that in order to explore my attachment to crafting, I needed to find something else that made it a bit more interesting. And I was listening to that particular podcast was an episode of In Our Time with Melvin Bragg. There's like loads, and they've been going for like 20 years or something on the BBC website. And they talked about a number of birds. There was another bird called the blackpool warbler, which is a tiny black and white warbler. And that's, I think, slightly smaller than a wheatear. But the wheatear itself had this tremendous journey. And then it also, because it's a bird that I see here. Now, the birds that I see here aren't the ones that make quite the same journey, because there are other populations of them that live in sort of like Greenland and Northern Europe and that go down to East Africa. So they're the ones that I'd be seeing. But I suppose something that's tangible to my own reality, and I talk about this interest in my daily birds as opposed to exotic birds. I like the ones, I feel more attached to the ones that I can see or might potentially see. So that just became a thing. I think anyone who's into birds will tell you that once you start, you kind of can't stop, because birds are everywhere, that you see one every time you leave the house, even in the middle of a city. And when you start thinking about what they do and where they go and where they come from and how delicate they are in these magnificent journeys that they make. But what the crux was really the idea that the little bird will go this one particular route that's completely inefficient. Even though there are shorter routes, just what I read there, there are shorter routes and more sensible routes, but it refuses to change because written into its genetic inheritance is this ridiculous long convoluted route. And I suppose that seemed very much to me to chime with the artistic impulse, for want of a better way of putting it. Why do I continue to feel the need to do this thing over other things? And I have this specifically, whereas other people have other things, or whatever the case may be. So I was interested in looking at that, the nature of that, and the book just kind of spanned out from there. And it could have gone. It's funny when you finish things, you find other things that you could have brought in, that it could have gone in a different direction, and that's happened to me repeatedly since. But you just have to say, okay, it was a moment in time. It is what it was then, and now it's over.
I was thinking, because I read both of your books during a pandemic. I read both of your books during lockdown, and I think as people were adjusting to like different types of rhythms and in their days, and like Ian, a whole nation going back to their childhood laneways and walking. Hopefully, going back and walking those spaces. And in so many respects, I think you talk about the inefficient path, the long way around that the bird, the Northern Meteor's flight path. And it seemed to me that your book is, Sara, that your book is sort of celebrating that to a particular extent, or making an assertion about using time outside that mode of capitalist production or productivity or efficiency, but in being. And I wonder if you could talk about that, maybe Sara and Ian, maybe we might look at that in terms of space in the bog. So Sara, if you wouldn't mind talking about that time and efficiency and making.
What I thought about there actually when you were talking was the Rebecca Solnit book in something about getting lost. I should know it.
Field Guide to Getting Lost.
Field Guide to Getting Lost. That's it. And the idea that going the wrong way or going the long way is somehow more useful than going the direct route. And I think during the pandemic in particular, a lot of people have sort of been forced to do that. And that's, I had no idea that the book would end up being so timely. It's funny the way things happen. Like, it was not published in any, it's been completely sort of published online, and everything has been online. But at the same time, it sort of found its moment in a weird way.
I found after I read your book, I actually went out and I literally dug a garden. I wanted to care for the things around me, and that I felt like I was encountering my space in a very different way. And Ian, for you, I think that coming back to the bog and this draw back to the place, your first place, and a different kind of time, allowing yourself just to wander. You describe wandering without destination and just being in a place and found sounds. And also, if you wouldn't mind also talking about, you compare Seamus Heaney's sense of the bog as a communal memory versus Tim Robinson, who sees it as a kind of obliteration or a space where people got swallowed and forgotten. So,
yeah, I guess so. On the latter part of that question, I guess Heaney, for a lot of people, and for me too, provided the sort of what did you call it, sustaining metaphor of the bog. For a lot of people, he explicitly characterized it as a national archive. And when I was younger, I definitely went along with that and understood it in that way. But I grew a little bit frustrated with it, the limitations of that metaphor. And I was actively looking for a better one or maybe an evolution of the same one. Because I felt the idea of it being an archive suggested that it was a place where things happened in the past and are now just, its only purpose is for things to be drawn out and sort of regarded as objects of the past. And I obviously felt that applied to the way people thought about the communities that live there as well, which I think links to maybe the first part of your question in terms of capitalist productivity and usefulness and efficiency. The bog is an obvious example of a place that has reached the end of its capitalist efficiency in very direct ways this year, particularly. But it's a process that's been happening for a long time, and that whole part of the country, the Midlands generally, and that's a big old part of the country, has largely just been skipped over and forgotten. And someone like Tim Robinson, and particularly his metaphor of people walking in and out of the bog and making paths as they go, I found that much more attuned, I guess, to the daily reality of people who live there, in that the bog is still being shaped by people. That part of the world is still being shaped by people and by the decisions they make and the habits they form and all these things that any other place would be. It's not just a kind of purely in the past kind of place. And so for me, Tim Robinson became that sustaining metaphor of looking for paths in and out of the things that I was interested in. And it isn't so much the destination that matters in that case. It's the path that you make as you go and come and go. And I was coming and going from that place all the time because I was not living there, but I was literally coming and going, getting the train up and down several times a year or several times a month sometimes, and observing the changes as I came and went, and observing the changes in myself and the changes in that place and in the people. So it was about I don't want to use the word journey, I suppose, but it is like Rebecca Solnit has also written a book about walking, and her book of migrations, which is about Ireland, she travels mostly on foot. I think there's something to be gleaned from those decisions to be so focused on walking, and the type of thinking and type of engagement with the world that you get when that's what you're doing.
Thank you.
And it's obviously not the most efficient way to get anywhere.
No. And just to move on from that, and I suppose both of you are in a lot of ways right about memory and forgetting, and those processes. And Sara, you write about objects with such care, and all objects. So a secondhand jumper from a charity shop that has somebody else's name stitched on the label. Just the care around the objects around you. And you quote Walter Benjamin around the idea of the aura of the object. And it really struck me because I suppose we live in such a disposable culture. During the lockdown, we we got to skip and filled it, and my son was horrified at the vulgarity of our waste, and myself included. But to see it from my children, to kind of look and to say this is, and so you write about that a little bit in the book. I was wondering if you could talk about that, and it's a way of. I felt like you were holding ground and holding objects to stop us from forgetting.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about time, and that's something that sort of comes up recurringly in it. This sort of constant questioning of, is this what I should be doing? Is this what I should be doing? Is this what I should be doing? And that was kind of partly why I looked at amateur art and the idea of capitalist time and doing what we feel we should be doing in order to earn money. So, and then amateur art being a sort of a rebellion, a useless dead use of time in a way, and a sort of rebellion against capitalism. But I also look at objects because I feel awful a lot of the time. Again, that was a means of justifying the amount of materials that I waste when I'm making something. For example, I start with a large block of plaster and then I carve lots of it away and realize the thing inside, whatever the object or shapes that I'm making, and then I throw away the rest of the plaster. And I feel awful about that, and I sort of try to balance that then with, I guess, with other things, with clothes. I don't really buy new clothes. I get secondhand stuff. I reuse the packaging that comes from. I use as molds all the time the packaging that comes from the from the food that I buy or whatever. But that's a funny one. Like I'm someone who irresistibly accumulates stuff but to me it's all meaningful stuff. It's but of course it isn't. Or it's someone else's, one person's meaningful stuff is someone else's useless crap. So yeah, no, that's something I was struggling with, and it's something that's been on my mind since the beginning of the pandemic as well. I think in particular because beforehand we were also careful about the amount of packaging, say, we were using and the things we were buying. And then in a way the pandemic gave everyone the excuse to be selfish again. And that's maybe an awful way of putting it, but those concerns about climate and materials, and maybe not capitalism, I think that's kind of loomed up. Capitalism and time is definitely something that's been brought more into focus. But I know an awful lot of people who just bought more crap online during the pandemic.
Guilty as charged.
And
I feel like I have no high ground because I make a useless art object, and I think that's okay. I think if I spend time on the object, the two things are so intertwined for me. If I spend time and put care into the object, and it has this glow that Walter Benjamin talked about, then it's okay.
I mean, it's a really interesting, naughty kind of question about like how do we value our time, and how do we value anything, I suppose, because I've been thinking a lot recently about like transactions and sort of transactional relationships and non-transactional relationships, and obviously there's a certain element of transaction that you need to do to kind of stay alive, pay the rent, whatever it is. But then it seems to me like for a lot of people lately, there's or a reduction in sort of non-transactional engagements with the world. And it becomes more and more difficult to think of systems of value outside of a monetary system or a capitalist system. But actually trying to come up with those, I guess, a shared sense of value, which is not transactional, seems to me probably the most meaningful kind of political project one could do. And you have to first of all, you probably have to find that within yourself, and making things that are of no use and spending your time in ways that are useless.
Yeah.
Is the first step on that.
And that's art, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And I write it, or I'm not sure, I think it's in the book, but I sort of write about how the most interesting stuff gets made when you think nobody cares about it, when nobody has commissioned you. When you think, and I just found it interesting because once I published a few books and the books were doing well and people were sort of asking me for bits of writing and blah, 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 that I was spending more and more time going back to the making of objects about which no one cared, and no one wanted. I'm not signed with a gallery. I don't regularly show. They all just, and I mean, really, that's the book is about. They all just go back in the room of junk, and yet in a way that was of more, I don't know, of more kind of existential use to me or something that I wanted to do. I just wanted to go back and do the thing that nobody cared about. Because once someone wants it, it changes. And yet at the same time, you make things in the hopes that they'll find people. So I don't know, there's some awful conflict going on there that I haven't figured out. But that's something I think about a lot because I've never earned money in quantity to the time or effort that I've put in. I put in a lot of effort and earn nothing, or I earn a lot of money for something that didn't take any effort. You sort of randomly get a literary prize or something like that. So I've never learned anything that's been helpful in my real life.
So I felt like both your books were quite not political, but that there was a dissent from a certain kind of way of being and suggested another way. I almost got the sense of you foraging, for found objects or found sounds, scrambling up the spaces where you were reared. There's something really poetic and inspiring about that, which is why I think I went out to the garden when I finished the book. Ian, just in terms of like memory and forgetting, your book, like I suppose, thematizes this on several levels because you have John Joe's Alzheimer's and his loss of memory, but also the place. You write, I've been drawn back to a place which I recognize now as being on the edge of disappearance, a place in the process of being forgotten entirely. And so there's two kinds of erasures happening in the book. And it struck me that even the title of the book, Minor Monuments, that in some way you're trying to to remember. And maybe if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the title of the book comes from Thomas Browne, his book about, it's called Hydrotaphia, urn burial, about a discovery of Roman urns in a field in Norwich near where he lived. And he says, time which hath an art to destroy all things hath yet spared these minor monuments. And it's there's also a coffee called Minor Monuments and at least two other books called Minor Monuments. So I'm not original in the title, but it was the first quote that I put in a notebook that pretty much the whole book ended up in. And it was just there the whole time. And the phrase stuck with me, particularly this sense of time destroying all things. And somehow this sort of miraculous holding on of the object, which again is very much a Benjaminian concept, the way that these objects collect dust and break down and but yet still linger in an environment which is kind of alien to them. And so a lot of the book is kind of about kind of extrapolating from that to look at how places get forgotten, how I forget things about the place where I'm from, or choose not to remember things. And obviously with my grandfather, his memory disappearing, that's a very literal version of forgetting. And recording for me, because my memory is not great anyway, recording has always been a way of helping myself to remember, but then recognizing the limitations of that as a method, because it's not complete and it changes both the experience in real time and what you're able to remember later on, and it changes the process of remembering. But I guess one of the really interesting things to me, and this goes to your question of sort of dissent, John Berger is kind of one of probably the leading influence on the book, really. he described the whole capitalist concept as being a way of cutting people off from their past and trapping them in a sort of eternal present and laden with an anxiety for the future. And I think that, to me, that seemed very correct. And he's explicitly talking about peasant society in France at that time, but, you know, peasant society in rural Offaly it's just as applicable. And I think there's a way of looking at that says that remembering in that context is political, that ways of life and ways of being, ways of seeing and ways of hearing can be instrumentalized against that capitalist process of forgetting, that sense of being cut off from the past. And I mean, for me, the way that works right now is that we're kind of suffused in the past all the time. We're just kind of overloaded with the past because it's always around, but at the same time, we're cut off from a personal connection to it. It's kind of a commercialized version of the past. And then, so trying to work through that sort of suffusion of everything that's been recorded and kept around to finding a more personal path through it and redeveloping that connection with one's own personal history or family history or social history. So that's kind of and never wanting to separate the processes of remembering and forgetting, because like I think it's Chris Marker in Sans Soleil, he says like remembering is the skin of forgetting, or forgetting is the skin of remembering. I can't remember which one it is.
Thank you. The choosing to write nonfiction, and I suppose that there might be certain expectation around like the nonfiction form, and you have a chapter called Fidelity. One of the essays is called Fidelity. There's this just beautiful line where you address the reader. So much of what I wanted to tell you could not be caught on tape, and I think it's one of the moments in the book where you're like us reading the book, and this desire of there's so much that can never be represented. But also that the fidelity of representation, that your recognition that this is just a construct and there isn't. And you have a beautiful story of your grandfather remembering the departure of his young sister for America and his misremembering. And I was wondering if you might just talk about that. Because in relation to nonfiction.
Yeah, I mean that's, I don't know, I think maybe Sarah feels similar in that what we're doing is absolutely not reporting, that there is a slippage all the time between the writing and what's happened, and the sort of a space kind of opens up between the reality of what's actually happened, such as we have access to that, and what we make of it. And that's true, I think, whether you're writing about something, whether you're painting something or drawing something, or like, that's where, I mean, recording this moment in the book where I say there's so much that can't be caught on tape. It's sort of explicitly acknowledging the limitations of that form of capturing things. And for me, one of the major sort of motivations in the book and sort of things propelling the book is figuring out the limitations of all the different types of recording that I'm typically engaged in, whether that's sound or visual or writing, and they all have their own separate strengths and weaknesses. And so what you get from, say, a perfectly silent family photograph from 80 years ago is quite different from what you get from, say, a piece of writing or something that you find in an archive or a census report or an essay. Like, these are all forms of recording, and they all break down in kind of interesting ways. And obviously memory is itself the ultimate and kind of basic form of recording, and that breaks down in its own compelling, sometimes very disturbing, distressing, sometimes very beautiful ways. And so John Joe sort of having this memory of his sister leaving 60 something years previous became solid in his mind in a way that it didn't for anybody else. You know what I mean? It was because memory like that has to be reconstructed actively every time you remember it. It changes every time you remember it. it's open to being re-remembered every time. And to me, that's one of the beautiful things about memory. And it's one of the things that recordings of any kind, to a certain extent, lack. I mean, that's one of the big themes of the essay in the book, which is kind of about Seamus Heaney, is that once you put it in writing, it's sort of set in stone. You don't get the freedom to misremember anymore. And I think, that maybe that's linked to a certain, similar kind of descent to what we talked about earlier on, of the freedom to kind of make of it what you will, rather than being kind of landed with this ball and chain of your own memory and history.
Thank you. And Sara, can I ask you about your step into nonfiction and the shape of your book, which sometimes has just a sentence on a page or a quote, and then punctuated by these photographs of the birds whose stories you're telling. And I suppose there's something quite itinerant and associative and were in your thought process maybe, or in the way the book is textured or layered.
Yeah, I think Ian already said this in a way, but it's not, I wasn't sort of trying to, you're trying to remember, you're trying to understand the present by writing about the past. And with what I loved about Ian's book, and what I'm really jealous of, is that he has such a strong, such strong roots, I suppose, and a place to kind of anchor them to. And I remember that I guess I'd written Handiwork by the time I read Minor Monuments, but I remember feeling like that was sort of missing. Like I grew up in the one place and I have a family home, but it only extends to, one generation, as in my parents moved there when I was small. So I don't kind of feel like I have this ancestral link, and we don't own any land. It's just kind of like a garden. So I think when I went back to look to remember, and to kind of draw up the past, I was looking to the actions of my family in a way. I was looking to the actions of my father and my grandfather in particular, what they did as opposed to where they came from. And so that was, I mean, sorry, you asked really about the structure of the book. I was just thinking of that when Ian was talking. But the structure of the book was supposed to be, it wasn't without influence. I'd read Han Kang's The White Book and say Book of Mutter by Kate Zambrano, Maggie Nelson's Bluets. There'd been like a little clutch of books that left a lot of white space in between. So I thought, I can get away with this. I'm also a big fan, actually. It's I mentioned it because it comes up. The Douglas Hyde Gallery comes up in Ian's just the first essay, I think, Richard Skelton, and that's a place that was hugely influential to me. And they published these little books. I don't know if you can see that. A long series that corresponded to each show, but were also kind of reflections by John Hutchinson, who was the director there for years. I worked there, and I spent a lot of time there over the years. So those books are very, very much like the more recent ones that I mentioned, the Han Kang and Olivia Sujak and that. So I always had it in my head that you could get away with writing a very short book with big gaps, but also because the content of the book was fragmentary, that I didn't want, by putting things together on a page, it made them seem connected when they weren't. By putting space between them, you could see the jump that I'd made, in my own mind. I wanted them to be like, it's funny, we talk a lot, my partner and I talk a lot about artwork and sort of the showing of artwork. And there's always this question about sort of making not much and leaving lots of space around it, and how that creates a completely different reception to something, to a gallery that's crammed with stuff. So I'm a big fan of the not much with lots of space around it. And I guess that reflected in the book, imagine it as like a painting on a wall and then a few things around it, and you pay more attention but that was horrible pressure as well in a way, because you think, and I think because this was poetry, I've never written poetry, because the responsibility of putting, I think you write poetry, do you, Una?
A little bit, very little. Yeah, it feels like you write poetry.
Well, I could never call it poetry, because I think it's the pressure of having a very small amount of words, lots of blank space around it. It just gives the words a responsibility that prose doesn't quite. You can aim for the same things in prose, but just call it prose, and it's easier. So yeah, I think that was the question. With the images, there were images in A Line Made by Walking. And again, I mean, the book that acted with the images, because I spent a long time taking a series of photographs of it was not roadkill, but it was creatures that had died and fallen to earth. And I sort of liked the idea isn't the right word, but I was sort of grasping at the idea that the world was ending and that things were just dying and falling from the sky. And so when it came to handiwork, I actually had a series of images of the stations of the house, little details of my tools and materials and stuff. But it was Lisa Cohen of Tramp who said, I'd love a picture of this bird, of the Northern Meteor. I want to be able to picture what it's like when I'm reading. So I thought, okay, I can't plausibly take a photograph because bird photography is impossible. And I can't use someone else's photograph. I can't really paint or draw very well. That's not my thing. So I thought I'll make one. I'll make it and photograph it. That's the only way I can do 2D. And then that became a making of many more birds. But it's everyone actually who's reviewed the book so far has taken it that the projects that I'm describing making in the process of the book are the birds, which is not true at all. They're completely different. It doesn't really matter. It's one of those instances where kind of people's misapprehension is a neater concept than the truth, which was they were many different kinds of things. So the birds were then made in retrospect and photographed specifically for the novel, and there's only about 20 of them.
Okay. What we might do is actually read out so that we might have Ian read first, just a short piece, and followed by Sara, and that will end the talk. And I just wanted to thank you both for being here today and for your beautiful books that you've brought into the world. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And everyone at the festival as well.
I'll pass it on. So Ian.
So I might read the bit about my granddad's sister, just because we talked about it, so I might do. My great aunt Chrissy left home at 14 to go join a convent. That was in 1954. The following year, she went with her fellow initiates to America. I'd always assumed that being the youngest of 8 children in a fairly poor family, she'd been forced to go. But when I asked her, she told me that she chose to leave, and that she found the idea of a nun's life adventuresome. Chrissy was an intelligent kid, and her mother, a forceful woman with real ambitions for her children, had pushed her to skip some years in school. But she felt lost among older kids, studying things she was too young to fully understand. She said that she felt shame and guilt over her struggles in school, and she was looking for a way out. It was true, too, that there wasn't much room for her at home. I did not have a voice, and learned early it was better to be seen than heard, she said. In the final years of his life, the memory of Chrissy's departure for America really tortured John Joe. He could not bear to be reminded of it, and would sometimes be moved to tears if it crossed his mind. 60 years after the event, he could still clearly recall standing with Chrissy in the yard at the back of their house, holding her hands on the morning she was due to leave. He remembered that she was a little girl in a brown skirt. They stood at the back door, they embraced, she was driven away, and it was 13 years before they saw each other again. A lot of life happened during those years that I wasn't privy to and was barely made aware of, really, Chrissy told me. Everyone was so busy in their lives, raising children and marrying and all of that. This memory stayed with John Joe long after most others had disappeared. He would tell the story in snatches, and I only caught its outline. He must have thought about that day a lot in the intervening decades, and now he was replaying the scene over and over in his rapidly emptying mind. As his brain calcified and his other memories vanished, this story expanded to fill the newfound space. Each detail became magnified in front of him, where they'd been standing, what was said, what happened next. He hovered over each of these points, reiterating them, binding them tighter to himself. John Joe could recall so little of his early life by then, that this memory was a precious weapon in his battle against the void. Shortly before John Joe was forced to give up driving, Chrissy came home for a visit. He brought her around in his jeep, to the bog, to the houses of old, mostly departed friends, and to the graveyard to see their parents' grave. Chrissy told me how proud Jonjo was of the new gravestone he'd erected there, how important that marker was to him. There's a photo of them there, standing by the grave with their sister, Josie. When they got home, Jonjo took Chrissy outside to the yard, and standing where they'd stood over half a century earlier, told her about the tender memory he'd been harbouring all that time, welling up at the effort of recounting it for her. Chrissy listened and did her best to lighten this burden he'd assumed. Really, it wasn't such a big deal. It wasn't his fault. And anyway, it was all so far in the past, almost a whole lifetime ago. Chrissy had stayed with the convent for 21 years, getting a college degree in teaching children. During that time, her life was practically prearranged. You just went with the flow of things and the flow of life and rules and regulations and work and all of that. You just went with life as it was laid out, she said. Eventually, in her mid-30s, she tired of the routine and left that world behind. She found new friends and partners. It wasn't easy to readjust to civilian life. She said that she was 50 before she felt like she'd grown up. I felt like I fitted in my skin and felt like I was my own person. Work, she said, was very important to her. She earned herself a master's degree in psychology and spent 40 years working as a mental health professional with deprived communities, prisoners, and war veterans. Chrissy never told Jonjo that his memory was wrong. She didn't tell him what she later told us, that all those precious details did not tally with how she remembered things. It couldn't have happened that way. She couldn't have been wearing a brown skirt. She wasn't a little girl. In truth, she had no memory of saying goodbye to him at all. It didn't make any sense to me in some ways, because if he was saying I was a little girl in a brown skirt and came out to say goodbye to him, or to tell him that I was going to America, then why would you have let me go, she said. But it was in his memory for whatever reason. If there was a delusional quality to it, so it was. He may have been grieving a little bit about me going away so young. And maybe there would have been some intervention in the family. But I don't know. We didn't talk about deep things.
Thank you. Sarah?
I'll read the bit. It's quite close to the end, and it's where the bird comes back to me, I suppose, where I get to meet the Northern Meteor. The island it describes is Cape Clear, which is about 8 miles off the southwest coast here. It's an island that I've spent quite a bit of time. It's very close to my heart. An island 1 mile wide and 3 miles long and 8 miles from the mainland, the most southern point of Ireland, autumn. A desperately unsmooth island, with too few mature trees and level surfaces. An island with a grotto, a lighthouse, a graveyard, a library and a porter cabin, a single shop cum pub that keeps an entirely capricious schedule of opening hours. An island that decides when and what you eat and drink, or if you eat and drink at all, because they have refused to come. I have decided I must chase them. The birds. Autumn is a season of serious activity. As soon as the Montbretia pitches out of the ditches and the ash leaves wrinkle and the wasp-eaten apples smash wetly against the slackening grass, so the migrant birds start to seek each other out again, to pick teams. The adults who know the way, the juveniles, many of whom will not survive their inaugural trip, getting caught up in storms or poisoned by agricultural pesticides, flying too fast and hard into buildings too tall, or the outstretched arms of pylons, the windscreens of planes, the propellers of wind turbines, running out of food, running out of energy, running out of habitats they once relied upon, pit stop once sustaining, now bulldozed, built over, barren. The starter birds. Their chances of ultimately arriving only about as good and likely as those of all the starter artists. And then there are the resident birds, who happen to fall in with a migrant flock of the same species over the course of the hazy, propitious summer. They will leave with their comrades even though they are not supposed to, in an act of optimism, or perhaps confusion. And lastly, there are the birds for whom this tiny island represents neither source nor destination, but a layover along the route of a longer passage, a pearl in the necklace of a protracted flyway. Blackcaps, turtle doves, fire crests, whimbrels, ruffs. The passage migrants are impervious to the grotto, the lighthouse, the graveyard, the library and a porter cabin, the shop cum pub. They stop for the insects that hatched in summer, for the weed that blooms in the emerald lake, for the smashed apples and blackberries the smashed apples and the berries of cultivated cotoneaster for the creatures that dwell in the festering seaweed above the shifting lines of the tide. For birds, autumn is a month of serious activity. And you will know them by their colour and size and shape, the birders say, and by the type of environment in which you find them in the rough time of year it is, by their song, but most of all, you will know them by their jizz, a style of flight of hop and perch, the way they hold their mortal parts and move, the way their small heads and limbs and wings interact with each other, with the world around them, with the ungraspable sky. There is a small songbird, the Northern Meteor. She weighs about as much as a small songbird, a pinch more than a robin, and a few pinches less than a thrush. Even though commentators always insist on making analogies with light objects one might more typically have cause to balance on the palm of a hand, a packet of crisps, a glass of water, a small ball of wool, a fountain pen, or with the cost of an envelope that could be posted for the price of 2 standard stamps, or with the hypothetical weight of a human soul. She topples out of the ditch in front of me, even though I am not searching for birds. I am not searching for poetic coincidences. I have not binoculars. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara and Ian.
Thanks, Una.